Dell comics are good comics. If you read comics during a certain era, this slogan may be familiar to you. But what did it mean and why was it there? Well, this slogan was part of a pledge to parents. Pledge just for me. This pledge was something that this particular comics publisher took to avoid the comics code. But it's not the stand against censorship that some modern readers think it is, at least when they hear about it in passing. When people hear that someone refused to sign the code or wouldn't work within it, oftentimes they see it as a sign of rebellion. But in reality, the parents' pledge comes from a very different place. There's a great deal of disdain for other comic publishers behind it, as well as a very pragmatic reason towards disassociation from some of the rest of the industry. There's also the ability to play in some semantics with the terminology when it comes to magazine or comic, particularly at the end of the golden age of comics as it was known, which ended in 1954. With the arrival of the code and the arrival of the Flash, the Barry Allen version sees the heralding of the Silver Age. I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and we recently did a video on the 1954 version of the code where we read it, all of it. We were looking at through the lens of what did it say specifically. There's a whole bunch of history and build up and fallout and just a lot of interesting stories surrounding the code. But in all of that kerfuffle, oftentimes the code itself and what it specifically said can be overlooked. So we did a video where we went through what it actually said. Just the facts, ma'am. But now that we've done that, it's time to branch out into fallout and lead up and other factors, other interesting stories. There's a lot of interesting tales in this era. And one such is the story of Dell Comics. When people think of comic companies time recording North America, they most often think of DC and Marvel. And the genre that tends to pop into people's heads first and foremost is superheroes. This is of course a generalization. It's not always the case. Depending upon what someone is reading, they may think of something else. But for the most part, that holds true. However, who and what one thinks of when the word comics is uttered has shifted over time, and will continue to do so. In the mid to late 1940s through the early 50s, DC and Marvel did not exist in the forms that we know them today. Their proto-companies did, namely National Allied Publications Inc., which would become DC, and Timely Comics, which would change over to being Atlas before it became Marvel, that in 1961, where they would take on the name of one of their early Timely comics, Marvel Comics. However, neither of these companies were the big publishing players at the time. Not when it came to the post-war era of comics, where what was popular was shifting. Superheroes had had their day, as had war comics. Instead, new genres were rising. It's in this post-war era with all these shifts happening where the general public, including regular people, politicians, academics, come to the conclusion that some form of intervention was required. Now, in this period of time, in the waning of the golden age, one of the biggest comic companies, if not the biggest, was Dell Comics. In 1953, admittedly in ads Dell was running, they claimed to be selling 26 million copies a month, 1953 being a year before the comics code was adopted. Dell Comics was under the umbrella of Dell Publishing. Dell Publishing had been found in 1921, with the comics arm emerging in 1929. Dell Publishing was founded by George T. Delacorte Jr., born George Tonkanaji Jr. He founded the company after he was dismissed from another position. This as president of Snappy Stories Distribution Inc. He used the severance to found his own company. This company would find success in many arenas for many years. One of its early successes in publishing was in pulp magazines, this for the Dell Publishing portion. Some of the pulp magazines or pulps they published were Cupid's Diary, All Detective, All Western, Public Enemy, and more. A sales chart of top titles being sold in 1946 would heavily feature outings that were being sold by Dell Comics. Not publishing, comics. Comic historian Mark Carlson stated that while they were only 15% of comic output, they controlled nearly a third of the market. And Dell Comics had a very specific target: children. This because Delacorte wanted the widest audience possible. He wanted to be publishing things that are being read by everybody. He stated that Dell Comics were for, quote time, children who have not learned to read as yet, and to those who perhaps mumble with their lips as they read. Dell Comics also dealt a lot with licensed material. Indeed, as time went on, Delacorte had found this was a very easy way to make money, and that you could offload some of the responsibility onto other players. Dell Comics worked with Disney, Warner Brothers Cartoons, Lone Ranger Inc., Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc., and the list goes on. So when it came to Dell Comics, there was already an association with kind of kids and family-friendly entertainment, and the company worked very hard to maintain this image, especially in the years leading up to the comics code hearings, and eventually the code itself. They would begin running ads in the 1950s. This in the Saturday Evening Post, full-page ads just saying that they were good comics. This because they wanted to get that idea out there into the public eye, to just really hammer it home, because at this point papers were regularly publishing articles and op-eds about how comics were very problematic and dangerous, and how they were the cause of the rise of juvenile delinquency and that something had to be done about them. So Dell was trying to plant his subconscious counterpoint, basically. The anti-comic sentiment of the era was very real. The code did not arise overnight. The fears surrounding comics built for years, alongside the rise of juvenile delinquency, which did occur in the post-World War II era. And society was looking for a reason. And while of course it was complicated, they latched on to one of the easiest ones. Gaming, I mean comics. It's entertainment's fault. Comics ended up getting a large share of the blame, and not purely on an angry anecdotal parental basis either. In fact, largely these fears came and were supported from the halls of academia. The psychology department. Thanks, Frederick Wertham. Frederick Wertham really was one of the stewards of this fear. He would travel giving lectures, or he would give lengthy interviews to newspapers. The idea would spread, gain traction, appear more and more in the media, start to get the attention of politicians. The average person would get more and more involved seeing all of these stories, and it would build into this big cycle where everything's feeding off of each other. And then of course he would publish his book, Seduction of the Innocent. It was intense. Some states wanted to ban comics in the late 1940s. Before the code was adopted in the early 1950s, some states were planning book burnings. It was into this environment that the idea of self-censorship came to look more appealing to certain publishers. And the comics code is not the first attempt at some kind of self-regulation amongst the publishers. There were proto-codes, but more on the proto-codes later. We're here for the pledge. Dell Comics rejects the code in all forms, including the proto-form, even though Delacorte was part of some of the committees that attempted to form around it. But Dell Comics was resisting for different reasons than, say, EC Comics under the leadership of Bill Gaines. On that side, the resistance was coming more from the idea that Wertham and his ilk were wrong. When it comes to Dell, it's more because they felt that they were above this discussion and were being unfairly lumped in with everyone else. Testimony given to Congress by Dell Vice President Helen Mayer indicates that sentiment. There was a lengthy statement given about why Dell Comics were just better and why they didn't need to be included and how unfair it was that they were. It's a big statement, but I want to read a chunk of it so you can get a full sense of just the vibe. So here we go. Helen Mayer talking to Congress. Get ready, dramatic reading, quote time. Mayer stated, "Although we are not here to defend crime and horror comics, the picture is not as black as Dr. Wertham painted it. We must give our American children proper credit for their good taste in their support of good comics. What better evidence can we give than facts and figures? Here they are. Dell's average comic sale is 800,000 copies per issue. Most crime and horror comic sales are under 250,000 copies. Of the first 25 largest selling magazines on newsstands, this includes Ladies' Home Journal, Saturday Evening Post." Note the Saturday Evening Post. They were running ads in one of the most circulated magazines of the time. 11 titles are Dell Comics, with Walt Disney's Donald Duck the leading newsstand seller. Some of these titles are Walt Disney's Comics, Warner Brothers' Bugs Bunny, Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse, Warner Brothers' Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, Porky Pig, Walter Lantz, Woody Woodpecker, Margie's Little Lulu, Tom and Jerry. The newsstand sales range from 950,000 to 1,996,570 copies on each of the above-mentioned titles. I mean newsstands only, and I am not including any subscriptions, and we have hundreds of thousands of subscriptions. With the least amount of titles, or 15% of all titles published by the entire industry, Dell can account for a sale of approximately 32%, and we don't publish a crime or horror comic. The flex. Mic drop. She's not done though. Dr. Wertham, for some strange reason, is intent on condemning the entire industry. He refuses to acknowledge that other types of comics are not only published, but are better supported by children than crime and horror comics. This is a very interesting point that isn't fully addressed in these hearings, is who is actually buying the comics, where are the demographics, those kind of things. You don't get specifics like that. It's much more panicky, even though she's only throwing that in to make her point about why Dell is separate and better. I hope that his motivation is not a selfish one in his crusade against comics. Yet in the extensive research he tells us he has made on comics, why does he ignore the good comics? Dell isn't alone in publishing good comics. There are numerous outstanding titles published by other publishers, such as Blondie, Archie, Dennis the Menace, and so forth. Why does he feel that he must condemn the entire industry? Could it be that he feels he has a better case against comics by recognizing the bad and ignoring the good? With regard to Dell's refusal to belong to the Comic Book Association, Dell has no other alternative. When the association was first introduced, we, after thorough examination, saw that Dell would be used as an umbrella for the crime comic publishers. Dell, along with these publishers, would display the same seal. How could the newsdealer afford the time to examine the contents of each comic he handled? The parents and children too would suffer from misrepresentation. Dell didn't need a code set down by an association with regard to its practices of good taste. We weren't interested in trying to go up to the marginal line in our comic book operation, as we knew we were appealing in the main to children. We have no regrets. In addition to the good feeling we have created among our loyal following, we have profited financially, so you don't have to publish crime and horror comics for financial success. To the contrary, Dell's policy of publishing good comics has served as well. So many shots fired. In short, Dell's stance is, screw you, Wortham. But also, we're not like the other trash-filled comics. The questions about who is reading which comics is a very interesting one, and again, it would have been interesting to actually conduct a study. Gaines wanted to do that. He wanted to actually get other academics together and form a counter study, but he couldn't get the other publishers on board. Also note that in Mayer's testimony, she confirms those numbers, that they're selling in the millions and that they are about a third of the market. Now, don't think that Dell Comics was above trying to silence others, because they weren't, especially when it looked like their profits could be harmed. Dell Publishing utilized their connections with their licensing partners to try and stop Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, from being published, because it was clear that it was going to have a negative impact on the industry as a whole. So Dell Publishing tried to get a letter campaign going, and these letters were sent to Wortham's publisher in the hopes that they would not publish it, aka torturous interference, and it did not work. It's just so interesting. There's so many pieces at play. I have to know, how does that make you feel? How would you feel about the idea of the book not coming out, being stopped? Because is that not in and of itself a form of censorship, which is ultimately what ended up happening to the entire industry? In part because of that book, even though it was published in 1954, Wortham was using his research compiled for it beforehand. Also, fun fact, Wortham felt that the code didn't go far enough. What a mess. Back to Dell, who was successful in presenting their own code alternative. They were able to do this because Dell sold well. They had a very recognizable and kid-friendly brand and characters that were well known, and they spent their time bolstering their reputation and their image. They were in a stronger position than others to opt out of the code. They also had to worry a bit less about the potential drawbacks of not being distributed because they had other distribution methods as well as the newsstands. They were also being released in department stores and the like, so they didn't have quite the same pressures as some of the other players. And of course, there was their seal, their parents' pledge. So what did it say? Are you ready for the pledge? Dell Comics, a pledge to parents. The way the Dell Comics just smack in the center like that, very awkward, poor placement. The Dell trademark is and always has been a positive guarantee that the comic magazine bearing it contains only clean and wholesome entertainment. The Dell Code eliminates entirely rather than regulates objectionable material. That's why when your child buys a Dell comic, you can be sure it contains only good fun. Dell Comics are good comics is our only credo and constant goal. Well, I'm reassured. I guess I can stop parenting and I don't have to read any of the Dell comics. This pledge was pretty big. Look at how much space it took up. This is huge. Of course, over time, it would get a bit smaller, but it was always a very big stamp. And sometimes even on the cover at the start, it would tell you that the pledge was on the inside. Other companies that were associated with Dell or distributed through Dell were able to skate too. Dell had a deal with Western Publishing, a partnership that had begun in 1938, though it would dissolve in 1962, to both of their detriments. The deal was Dell would finance and distribute their publications, Western would supply the printing. Other labels would be Whitman, which would follow over with Western post-dissolution, and they would create Gold Key, which would be active again post the partnership breakup, and Western also kept most of the licensed properties when they dissolved, a blow to Dell. By then it was the 60s, and they had been so long intertwined that at the start not everybody noticed that Gold Key was actually something separate until they started playing around what they were doing, because at the start Gold Key also did licensed material. Since Dell never signed the code, it meant they could ignore it years later when they did start to play with certain things, like adapting Dracula or Frankenstein, although many say that those attempts at adaptation were very much mocked, and they appeared later in the 60s. And they were very brief. They weren't ongoing series. There were only a couple of issues. By the late 60s, there was a loosening happening in the comics code itself in general. 1971 would see it revised, and certain monsters with literary pedigree would be allowed in. Another angle Dell could have taken at the time, but didn't really need to because Dell Comics was so separate from Dell Publishing, was the idea of saying that their comics weren't comics at all, but magazines, because there were some technicalities where maybe you could skate by if you were publishing a magazine and not a comic, even though for some of these magazine outings, from a modern reader's perspective, you would be like, what's the difference? And also, as you know, sometimes they use the word interchangeably, comic magazine, sometimes they don't. But magazines were oftentimes stored on a different part of the newsstand, so that could matter. But for some, it was just a mentality of what they thought of as comics and what they didn't. Something you can still see in play today. People ask questions of, is a webcomic an actual comic? I'd say yes, some people would say no. And that answer has shifted over time. When it came to Dell, their magazine outings were their pulps, and their pulp days were largely behind them by the point when the code came into effect because the popularity of the genres they they were publishing in that regard had dwindled. Plus, in the pulp arena, they had moved into publishing paperbacks thanks to that partnership with Western Publishing. And their comics, they had that pledge, and what a pledge. Questionable content eliminated. Except for the times when it wasn't. In conclusion, Dell used its reputation, popularity, connections, and the genre they worked in to avoid the code, but not for really any altruistic or anti-censorial reasons. At least if those were present, they weren't the main ones. Or if they were, they chose to keep them to themselves, not be vocal about it, again, like say, Bill Gaines. It seems likely, given how Dell had been backing out of attempts to form self-censorial publishing boards for years before the Senate hearings forced the issue, that they really did think they produced a different type of comics than the others. And in all fairness, they did. But they not only weren't alone in that, but they seem to have a bit of disdain for the same comics Wortham does, while also having contempt for the man himself. Or do you think they have a point? They weren't the same as, say, an EC comic or a Harvey comic. So why should they have been branded with the same brush? Or have to sit under the same stamp of approval if they felt that they shouldn't be lumped in the first place? As always, there's so much going on in this time period. This was a sampler, a teaser. There are many more details. There are so many more full transcripts, articles. It's very much worth looking into yourself if you're interested. It's out there. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it. Open the door for if you're interested. That was the tale of Dell and how they dodged the code and why. Ultimately, Dell Comics would become defunct in 1974. Over the years, taste shifted and other comic companies rose, even with the code's restrictions, and eventually Dell's method of relying on kid-friendly licensing fell apart, and their attempts to try other genres fell very flat. Would this pledge have reassured you at the time? And in all fairness, it's easy to get panicked and hyped up about such things, especially if one is being swept up in the fervor. Again, you still see things like that happen to this day. People get into that mob mentality real easy, especially when it seems like something is presenting an easy answer and something with a solution to a very big and complicated problem. Back to the questions. Do you think Dell was all that anti-censorial or just out for their own interests? Bit of both? Or do you feel that some of these other comics being published in the era were a lot of a lot? Do you like hearing about the history surrounding this era? If you do, let me know by giving this video a like. That was vintage. That was YouTube classic. We're peeling back the layers of the code era like an onion. Share your thoughts down below, and while you're down there, comment, subscribe. And if you have any interesting historical tidbits of your own, share them. You know I love to hear them. Thanks so much for taking some of your day spent discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.